Welcome to our lesson on what is a watershed. Our objective here is to help you understand the importance of studying the watershed, and I want you to be able to identify the major threats to the health of the watershed. So firstly, what is a watershed? Well, a watershed is an area between two high points of land. If you look here and here, and in between that area is lowland. And that lowland collects and stores water. So there may be rivers, there may be lakes, but all the water is being brought downhill to one big area where it'll eventually move to the ocean or simply collect and sit. So if we look at Manitoba, we are in the middle of one of the largest watersheds in the world. All water flows from Saskatchewan and Alberta this way, and from Minnesota and North Dakota that way, and from Ontario this way. It all gathers here in Lake Winnipeg and Manitoba, and then travels up the Nelson River here and into the Hudson Bay. So if you think about where is the water stored in Manitoba, well, we're the land of many lakes, and if you look at this map, you can see lakes all over the place. All that water sits and gets collected and eventually slowly works its way back to the ocean. So your first shout out. What is a watershed? I'd like you to write down the definition of watershed. Write the definition, a low area that water from rivers and lakes collects. So what is in a watershed? Well, farms, cities, houses, humans, animals, plants, all of these things in this list, I'm not going to read all of them, are all part of a watershed. We're part of the watershed. The actions we take, the things we do, they all affect the health of a watershed. So how do we affect it? Well, how we use our land, where we put sewage lagoons, where we build ditches, where we drain land for farm, that all affects the watershed. And pollution, agricultural waste such as manure, fertilizers, pesticides, all of those things can get washed into the watershed and affect the health of lakes and other rivers. Household wastes, like Drano, dishwashing fluids, all of those things can affect the watershed. Oil from cars, if poured down a drain, can affect the watershed. And then there's industrial waste as well. Large factories use many chemicals, and if they're not treated properly, can wind up in the water. And also erosion. Natural erosion moves earth, which can affect the watershed. But also how we develop and what we build can affect where water goes and what gets eroded, and it can affect the watershed as well. Urban runoff is a big one. Urban's a fancy word meaning city. And in streets, parking lots, roofs, driveways, and lawns, anything that hits the driveway or hits the ground, like oil, antifreeze, any chemicals being used, they all go down the drain and they'll all wind up in the watershed. So here's your shout out. What are some sources of pollution in the watershed? Here's a list for you to record in your journal. And the whole point of a watershed is to collect, store, and release. Three things it has to do, almost like a recycle triangle. Collect, I'll put C here. Then we have store, and then we have release. The whole point is that the water keeps cycling through the watershed. And the things that affect how watersheds store and collect water are mountains and valleys, because they act as barriers to water. Plants, the more plants you have, the less erosion there is, the more water gets held by the plants, which is a good thing. But it can also lead to flooding, or it could lead to rapid erosion. And man-made surfaces. Parking lots in cities affect how water moves and what areas get more flooded than others. Also, water from the watershed is stored in wetlands, lakes, and reservoirs. So places like Oakhammock Marsh, Lake Winnipeg, Lake Manitoba. And then, of course, the soil, groundwater, snow and ice. And when we say biology, we mean plants and animals. All those things hold water back as part of the watershed. And of course, the watershed is released through streams, rivers, groundwater, water that evaporates will precipitate and land back in lakes and rivers. And then, of course, human engineering. Sources like Manitoba Hydro build dams to generate energy, but they also affect the flow of the water out of the watershed. So if we look here, here is our watershed, and you can see that all the water that falls on the land flows down. So any erosion will carry earth down into this pond, and any chemicals or fertilizers are going to wind up in that pond, and they're all going to affect the ecology of the watershed. So we study this very closely to see how much nutrients or chemicals or fertilizers, all those things as they go into the lake cause changes, and then they actually affect the ecology of the whole watershed. So for your homework, I want you to think back to what we talked about throughout the whole lesson and describe why is it important to study the watershed.